Hello and a very warm welcome to Engineered Unicorns, fantastic books for a magical lifestyle. My name is SandyJ and you're listening to Campus Radio Karlsruhe. It's May, I'm back and I desperately needed the break. I quite enjoyed myself. At first I read a ton of manga and just audiobooks and non-fiction, and now, after I finished sorting some stuff out, literally and metaphorically. For instance, I sorted out some socks. Yeah, I know, riveting stuff does need to be talked about on the radio. But I also sorted out some other stuff that needed more brain power. And because I have that done, most of it, I actually have more freedom to read what I want. And actually, I got back into epic fantasy. I'm very, very happy about this because the last few years I only read shorter fantasy. And as you may know, epic fantasy tends to be heavy on the page count. And I'm currently reading The Final Empire by Brandon Sanderson. I was pushed in this direction because, as you may have noticed in March, there was this huge Kickstarter by Brandon Sanderson. Because apparently when he has time on his hands, he writes. As if he wasn't writing enough, but he had more times during the pandemic because all those fan conventions and so fell through. He didn't have to travel so much, and so he had more time to write. And so he wrote some stuff just for him and his family. Essentially, it's 4 books that he just wrote. No, 5 books, and 4 of those were in the Kickstarter campaign that he did. And if you don't know what Kickstarter is, or Kickstarter campaigns are crowdfunding, which means that somebody has an idea or a book, a gadget, or card games or board games are very heavy at Kickstarter, and then you get funding by a crowd, by people who like this, who want this. Brandon Sanderson cracked all the records with that Kickstarter campaign. He set out to get $1 million in funding, $1 million. It ended with more than $41 million. Until then, the highest Kickstarter campaign was 21 million. So he crushed this. He made history with that. 70,000 people backed it, and the books will come out in 23. So you could get different tiers. I naturally only get the digital tier because the shipment costs are really abnormal, and so I'm looking forward to reading some new Sanderson novels next year. Until then, I have more than enough stuff to read. And as I've said, I'm currently reading The Final Empire by him. I first started reading the copy of the library because you can get the whole Mistborn trilogy at the Karlsruhe Library System. And I started out with The Final Empire, naturally, because that's the first of the first Mistborn trilogies. And it's so good and so engrossing that I needed my own copies because I also wanted to annotate, and you're not allowed to do that with library books. And because I wanted to just, underline stuff and highlight stuff. So now I have my own Mistborn trilogy at home, and I read it on my weekends because they're free, and I have the brain power now, the brain space, to really sink into a very engrossing and very rich fantasy world. And I have also the needed patience because one of those books is more than 600 pages long. Every one of those books is more than 600 pages long. And so I needed to be in the right headspace for it. And since the Easter holidays this year, I'm finally in the headspace for epic fantasy again, which I was waiting for desperately. You might remember that I tried to read Wheel of Time last year, the first book of Wheel of Time, but I just couldn't get into it. And I didn't like that I was doing it with another group of readers to read Wheel of Time, but I didn't like the pressure to get to a certain point in the series at a certain point in time, and so I didn't finish the book. It's different now with Sanderson's Final Empire. I quite enjoy it, though I'm also not putting any pressure on me that I have to finish it by a certain date. Now I'm back into epic fantasy. I naturally also am reading non-fiction. Currently, I still read it as an audiobooks. In February, I realized that I can make a dent in my TBR stack by it, because I have or had a lot of non-fiction books in my TBR stack. Some of them were older than a decade, and with them being now audiobooks and available easily. By the way, the public library system has new audiobooks on Libby. Public Library of Karlsruhe has new audiobooks so go check them out. They also have other new books on there, so just, in case you are interested. I read several of my old books that I had. Some of them were disappointing. Didn't like them. I finished them, but and then I could get rid of the physical copy of this book finally after 10 years. And the others were quite nice, and I still got rid of the physical copy of those books. One of the books that I read as audiobook was one of the recommendations I have for you for this episode, and others I don't want to talk about because I didn't like them. I also found a ton of other books that I want to read naturally, so while I got rid of some of those books in my TBR stack, I added others, not least those Sanderson books, which are warpers because they are more than 600 pages, one of those books of the trilogy. So that was the time until now, more or less. One of the things that happened and that had a pretty big impact in Europe and on myself, it's still ongoing, and it really distressed me, and I wanted to understand better what's happening. On a meta level, I didn't want to get into the history of those two countries. So I looked around and I found a book, a non-fiction book, a philosophy book that somehow fit and that I want to recommend to you. And I read this in conjunction with the other book that I had already in my TBR. And somehow those two books together managed to explain what on a meta level is happening currently in the world and the shifts and political system in a very meta way. So my two non-fiction recommendations for this episode are The Open Society and Its Enemies by Karl R and The World is Flat by Thomas L. Friedman. Now, The Open Society and Its Enemies was written during the Second World War. Karl R is an Austrian philosopher. He is mostly known for his science philosophy, but he also wrote The Open Society and Its Enemies, and it started out as two books. And the first book is more on Plato, the philosopher, and his views, and the second book is on Hegel and Marx. And it's pretty obvious that Karl R is really against totalitarian states. Interestingly, Plato thought that totalitarian states are the best version of a state. Plato absolutely abhorred democracy and Athens and its time when he lived. I didn't know that. I had ethics in school way back when, and I thought Plato was one of the nice guys, but apparently he wasn't. I was quite shocked about this. What also shocked me, as Hegel is obviously also, he's very well known in European circles, especially in German circles, but he wasn't a nice guy either. I didn't know much about Hegel, so this didn't make a big impression on me when I read this book. But Plato and Marx, what Popper has to say to Plato and Marx was quite surprising to me. I was absolutely shocked when he talked about this. Now, the book is more than, when you put both of them together, it's more than 800 pages, so it's very long. Because it was 2 books initially, it's normal that you stop after the first part on Plato. You will need to recuperate because it's very, very heavy stuff. But Popper is so succinct. It's interesting. You do stay with them. And it's not like other non-fiction books where you just drift off and where you have sometimes trouble to stick to the argument that you listen to. In case of Popper, you stay. I don't know how he does this. It's a very, very good book, and it was even listed as one of the 100 best non-fiction books of the 20th century. And a friend of mine also read it, and he was absolutely also blown away. He had the same reactions as I had, and we don't normally. So this book is definitely a recommendation. The other non-fiction book which I read between the 2 parts of The Open Society and Its Enemies is Thomas L. Friedman's The World is Flat, which was published in 2005 in the first edition. I listened to the second edition. And Thomas L. Friedman makes a good point about what happened during the last decades, because the world has opened up much more. We are much more interconnected. So essentially we have much more open societies. And he talks about what brought this on. When you read those 2 books in conjunction, then it's very interesting, and you understand much more on a meta level what's happening, because we all thought that the Cold War was over, and essentially we thought it's getting better society-wise. But as we've now learned, there are still forces in our societies which want to close off again those societies. And to understand this, how those things are interconnected, those 2 books, to read those 2 books, help me understand it much more. So those 2 books that I'm trying to recommend to you are Karl R. Popper, The Open Society and Its Enemies, and Thomas L. Friedman, The World is Flat. Both books are available at the Karlsruhe Library System. Now, my fiction recommendation is also on politics, but it's very, 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 very amazing book. It's called The Goblin Emperor by Katherine Addison, and it won the Locus Award and was nominated for a Nebula and Hugo Award, and it was published in 2014. It's a fantasy book. It's not epic fantasy, so don't worry, it's not that long. And essentially it's Maya is a son, but not the heir apparent, of an elven emperor. But he is mixed race because his mother was a goblin. And because of that, his father didn't like him or his mother. So he lived away from court. And he only met his father once. He only met his brothers once. He's about 17 when the story begins. And he's living in exile. And he has to deal daily with his guardian, who isn't a nice man and who treats him not so nice. He lives there, and then a courier comes and tells him his father and the brothers, the heirs of the emperor, died all in an accident. And which is suspicious because they were riding on an airship, and apparently the airship just was destroyed. And now he is the new emperor. Maya, which is the main protagonist, isn't really brought up to be an emperor because he was in exile, because he was very, very far down the line to become emperor. Now he has to go to court and deal with being in a completely different position. He only has basic understanding about how the court works. He only has basic understanding on etiquette and everything. So he has to deal with all this. And this book is very special in that regard. That's not that he has to unite the kingdoms or something like this. It's not like he is this usual chosen one trope. It's much more going into depth and how court works and how this power struggles and the restrictions because you are a powerful person and are on court, how this person, Maya, deals with them, what it does to him, how he has to think of everything, how he can't trust or has to trust some people, and how to deal with court intrigue, how to deal with his estranged family, how to deal with the whole kingdom that he has to suddenly govern, and how an emperor, a leader, is restricted in his or her movements because of what's expected, what's security-wise expected and needed, and all that stuff. So this is much more a psychological study than a fast-paced fantasy novel. It's completely different to, for instance, The Final Empire by Brandon Sanderson. And it's also completely different, for instance, from The Melanson Empire by Stephen Erickson, or even The Wheel of Time. It's nevertheless a really interesting read, and I was very, very fascinated by this, because by Disney and all those fairy tales, you're often told or indoctrinated to think that, oh, when you're a prince or a princess, your life is cool and you can do whatever you want and so on. Turns out it doesn't. It's not like this. You are very, very restricted in your behavior and what's okay and to do and not to do, what to say and not to do. Say everything is put under restraints. And this book is very, very interesting in that regard, to read about this without being bound by the reality of the everyday life we have. And the reality, it's interesting to see what power does to a person, or how a person can grapple with that and how to deal with it. And I learned a lot through that. It's a very, very good read. I highly recommend it. So these 3 books, all on politics in a weird kind of way, very different way. All of those are available at the Karlsruhe Library System. And my 2 non-fiction recommendations were Karl R. Popper, The Open Society and Its Enemies, and Thomas L. Friedman, The World is Flat. My fictional recommendation is Katherine Addison, The Goblin Emperor. And now we are at the end of this episode already. I'll be back in June with new recommendations for you. And yeah, I hope you enjoyed this new episode. I hope you are well. Don't lose hope. This was the newest episode of Engineered Unicorns, fantastic books for magical lifestyle. My name is SandyJ. You are listening to Campus Radio Karlsruhe, and the music, as always, is by Aaron Schmidt. Hear you soon.